September 1944. Inside a requisitioned Belgian spa hotel, an American colonel was eating peaches from a porcelain bowl while the casualty lists arrived warm from the front. Not telegrams, not rumors. Stretcher tags. Blood-stiff paper tied to boys who had been alive that morning and were gone before supper. The colonel read one tag, set it beside his coffee, and said the same sentence he had been saying for 9 days. The nurses are essential here. Here meant polished floors. Here meant clean sheets. Here meant a dining room where officers with bronchitis were served broth by the best surgical team in the district. And 16 miles east of that table, men with torn bellies were dying because the hands trained to save them were carrying trays. By the end of that week, one nurse would move an entire surgical section without permission. One colonel would be sent to the front holding a basin full of amputated bone, and a medical directive that had taken years to build would be rewritten in a single afternoon. But the first weapon drawn in that room was not a pistol. It was a field tag, a little rectangle of paper with a dead man's name on it. And once General Marcus Rourke dropped it onto that white tablecloth, nobody in the hotel could pretend the war was somewhere else. Her name was Lieutenant Ruth Ellison, 31 years old, a surgical nurse from a county hospital outside Duluth, Minnesota, where winter storms could trap an injured man for 12 hours before a doctor reached him. She had learned early that medicine was not only skill, it was distance, it was heat. It was whether the person who knew what to do could reach the body before the body stopped waiting. By September 1944, Ellison's detachment had already worked through Normandy, through the road convoys, through nights when the operating lamps ran on bad gasoline and every tent smelled like blood, canvas, and wet wool. Her hands were quiet. People noticed that first. Not soft, not delicate, quiet. When a room fell apart, Ellison's hands did not. That was why the forward surgeons kept asking for her unit. Not politely, not as a preference, as a necessity. The Allied advance had stretched itself thin across broken roads, bombed bridges, orchard lanes, and villages still smoking from yesterday's shelling. On maps, the arrows looked clean. On the ground, every mile created wounds faster than the medical chain could absorb them. A man hit in the abdomen 16 miles from surgery had a poor chance of living long enough to see a clean table. Move the surgical team close enough to cut within the first hour, and everything changed. Same plasma, same instruments, same morphine. Different distance, different hands. That was the whole truth, and it was simple enough for any stretcher-bearer to understand. The problem was that the people with clipboards had learned to make simple things impossible. Colonel Edwin Vale commanded the hotel hospital. He was 56, polished, courteous, and famous for being difficult in ways that sounded reasonable on paper. His headquarters occupied the old spa dining room. High windows, marble columns, a chandelier packed in burlap but still hanging above him like a private flag. Vale had turned the place into what he called a stabilizing convalescent environment for senior personnel. There were supply logs, bed charts, laundry cycles, a kitchen schedule, a requisitioned wine cellar he insisted was strictly for medicinal spirits. And there was Ruth Ellison's surgical team, assigned to linen control, meal service, and chart copying, because Vale believed a hospital must first look like a hospital before it could heal anybody. Ellison filed 4 transfer requests in 11 days. 4. Each request named the forward station, the casualty rate, the staffing gap, and the number of surgical cases delayed past survivable windows. Vale returned every one of them with the same blue pencil note. Current assignment essential. Essential. That word followed her down the corridors. It was pinned to laundry carts. It sat on folded pillowcases. It hovered above men coughing in clean beds, while infantrymen bled through dirty blankets on the far side of the forest. Ellison did not shout. That was not her way. She kept her nurses drilling at night in an empty bathing room behind the hotel kitchen. They practiced instrument passing on overturned crates. They timed plasma lines with borrowed pocket watches. They rehearsed abdominal packing in silence until the motions became memory. Because she still believed orders would come. She had not yet understood that Colonel Vale was not delaying the orders. He was building a wall around them. The wall cracked on a Tuesday morning. A captain from the 38th Infantry Division arrived soaked through his field jacket, carrying a transfer packet sealed in oilskin. His boots left black water across the marble floor. He stood in front of Vale's breakfast table and placed the packet beside the peaches. Immediate movement of Lieutenant Ellison's Surgical Nursing Detachment. Forward surgical support. Departure within 1 hour. Vale opened the packet, read it, closed it. Then he lifted his spoon and said, "No." Not pending review, not awaiting confirmation. No. The captain thought he had misheard. Vale explained that his hospital held officers whose recovery carried strategic importance. He explained that rear area care required stability. He explained that the front always believed its own emergency to be permanent. Then he said something the captain wrote down word for word. Combat losses are tragic, but they are not a license to dismantle a functioning medical facility. The captain looked around the dining room, at the linen, at the peaches, at Ruth Ellison standing near the service doors with a tray in her hands and no expression on her face. Then he asked, "How many combat wounds are in this building right now?" Vale did not answer. That was the answer. The captain left the table, crossed the rain-slick courtyard, and climbed into the radio truck. The message he sent was not long. It named the order. It named the refusal. It named the colonel. And then, because anger makes some men precise, it named the peaches. General Marcus Rourke arrived 38 minutes later. No escort column, no ceremony. One jeep. 2 staff officers running behind him because he had stepped out before the vehicle fully stopped. The hotel lobby went silent when he entered. Rourke was not a large man, but fury gave him size. He walked straight through the lobby, past the nurses, past the orderlies, past a major who tried to salute and missed the timing completely. The dining room doors were half open. Rourke kicked them the rest of the way. Vale stood. "General, I was not informed." Rourke threw a stretcher tag onto the table. It skidded through a ring of coffee and stopped beside the bowl of peaches. The room did not breathe. Rourke said quietly, "Read it." Vale looked down. "General, read it." The tag belonged to Private Samuel Kravitz, 19, Pennsylvania. Fragment wound, abdomen, delayed evacuation, died before surgical intervention. Rourke placed a second tag on the table, then a third, then a fourth. "Those 4 died last night waiting for a team you had serving breakfast." Vale's face changed, but not enough. He began to speak about jurisdiction. Rourke cut him off. A hospital in a campaign has one purpose. It puts useful hands where dying men can reach them. He pointed at the dining room. This is not a hospital. This is a waiting room for comfort. Then he pointed east, toward the sound nobody in the room had been allowed to name. That is where the hospital is. Vale said the transfer would disrupt medical administration. Rourke stepped closer. Colonel, if your administration requires trained surgical nurses to carry soup while riflemen bleed out beyond knife range, then your administration has joined the enemy. The sentence sat in the room like a live shell. Vale reached for a regulation binder. Rourke picked up the field telephone from the sideboard and put it in his hands. You have 10 seconds to authorize the movement. Silence. 9. Vale stared at him. 8. The captain by the door stopped breathing. 7. Vale lifted the receiver. Within 30 minutes, Ellison's unit was outside in the rain, climbing into 3 trucks with surgical packs, plasma crates, instrument rolls, and the battered confidence of people who had been held too long in the wrong place. Ruth Ellison did not look back at the hotel. Not once. The convoy made it 11 miles before the paperwork found them again. A military police checkpoint blocked the road near a shattered stone bridge. The lieutenant in charge had a clipboard wrapped in cellophane against the rain and the grave, careful face of a man about to obey the wrong order. He told Ellison the movement required counter-authorization from the Regional Medical Control Board. She handed him Rourke's signed order. He read it, apologized, and kept standing in the road. The Control Board's directive had frozen all rear-area medical transfers while staff allocations were being reviewed. The directive had been written for a slower war, by men sitting 40 miles behind one, and it had not yet discovered that wounded soldiers could not pause their bleeding until forms caught up. Ellison asked how long review would take. The lieutenant said 4 to 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours. At the intake rate reported from the forward station, that meant roughly 30 new surgical cases before sunset. Of those, maybe half would arrive alive. Fewer would stay that way. Ellison stepped down from the cab. Rain ran off the brim of her helmet. She looked at the lieutenant, then at the road, then at the line of trucks full of women trained to do the one thing the front could not replace. And she said, "Move your barrier." The lieutenant did not move. Neither did Ellison. For 1 full minute, the war narrowed to 2 people standing in the rain on a road built for traffic and now occupied by procedure. Then a jeep came up from the east, fast enough to slide in the mud. Lieutenant Colonel Amos Reed got out before it stopped. Reed was a combat surgeon, 37, red-eyed, 2 days of beard, sleeves stiff with old blood. He had operated for 41 hours out of the last 48, and when he saw Ellison's truck sitting behind the barrier, something in his face gave up on patience. He took the checkpoint phone, called Rourke's staff, said 12 words. Then he handed the receiver back. 22 minutes later, the counter order arrived. The barrier lifted. The convoy moved. Those 22 minutes did not look like history. They looked like trucks starting again. They looked like tires pressing rainwater out of mud. They looked like Ellison climbing back into the cab and saying nothing, because every minute already had a body attached to it. The forward station was not a hospital. It was a farmhouse, a barn, 2 canvas flies, a stone cider shed, and a smell that told the truth before anyone spoke. Blood, disinfectant, wet straw, burned powder drifting in from the road. Captain Paul Hasker, the station medical officer, gave Ellison a briefing that lasted exactly 40 seconds. 43 patients on site, 19 surgical, 7 abdominal, 5 chest, 8 compound fractures inbound from a mined convoy, 2 medics still standing, 1 assistant asleep on his feet. No reserve plasma after midnight. Ellison listened. Then she turned to her unit. Barn is primary. Cider shed becomes recovery. Ambulatory wounded south wall. Instruments here. Plasma line there. Nobody waits for a perfect room. And then the locked hands went to work. Not heroically, at first. That is the part stories often get wrong. It was not music. It was not speeches. It was sleeves rolled higher, boots slipping in straw, lamps adjusted, trays boiled, clamps counted, men lifted, names written, pulses checked, sheets cut away, wounds opened, wounds packed, wounds closed, over and over. A German mortar strike hit a supply road at 0210 and sent 27 more casualties into the yard before dawn. Ellison's team absorbed them without drama, because drama was a luxury for people not holding pressure on an artery. By the end of the first 48 hours, Reed compiled the numbers. Before Ellison's unit arrived, penetrating trauma survival at the station had been running at roughly 1 in 3. After arrival, it rose to just under 7 in 10. Same road, same barn, same instruments. Different hands, different distance. Reed attached one sentence to the report he sent west. This is what the hotel was using for table service. Colonel Vale did not see that report immediately. By then, Rourke had solved his comfort problem in a way no regulation had anticipated. Vale had been removed from the hotel command and placed on temporary duty at a forward triage post. No tailored tunic, no dining room, no chandelier in burlap. Just a canvas apron, a basin, and a surgeon who put a bone saw into his hand and said, "Hold this until I ask for it." The first shell he heard up close made him duck. No one laughed. They were too busy. A boy on the table was asking for his mother. A medic was vomiting behind the tent. A lamp was swinging hard enough to throw shadows over the surgeon's hands. Vale stood there holding the bone saw like a man holding a piece of a language he had never bothered to learn. And for the first time in his career, the distance between a decision and a body disappeared. But the war was not finished teaching. 3 days after Ellison reached the farmhouse, German artillery began probing the road network east of the station. It started as distant impact, then closer, then patterned. At 0600 on September 18th, the first round landed in the north orchard. The barn shook. Dust fell from the beams. Ellison was assisting Reed on an abdominal case when the shock moved through the table. He looked up. She did not. "Again?" he asked. "Count it," she said. A medic at the door counted the seconds between impacts. 90, 88, 92. Walking fire. The shells were not random. They were being walked south, one adjustment at a time, toward the farmhouse yard. The station had 46 patients on site. 29 could not be moved quickly. 4 were open on tables. The field phone reached an artillery liaison who said counter-battery support was engaged elsewhere. Estimated response time, 20 minutes. 20 minutes was another polite way to say, too late. Ellison looked across the yard. The cider shed had low stone walls and sat 30 yards south of the barn, half dug into a slope. It was ugly, damp, and built by people who expected winter to try to kill them, which made it the safest structure in the yard. She made the decision in less time than it took Reed to tie a vessel. Ambulatory cases to the cider shed. Litter teams take anyone who can survive movement. Surgical tables stay. Nobody moves an open chest. Hasker shouted that patient disposition required physician order. Ellison was already at the door. Then order it. He stared at her. Another shell landed closer. Hasker said, "Do it." 6 minutes. That was all they had. 6 minutes to separate the men who could be moved from the men who would die if they were. 6 minutes to turn the least injured into carriers for the almost dying. 6 minutes to move bodies over mud while the sky stepped closer. A sergeant with one usable arm dragged a private by his collar. A clerk with a head bandage carried plasma bottles in his teeth because both hands were full. Ellison moved 3 men herself, one under each arm and one shouting that he could crawl if she would stop pulling. She did not stop pulling. The 7th round hit the north end of the barn. The storage wall blew inward. Medical crates burst open. A beam came down where 2 cots had been 6 minutes earlier. Inside the operating area, Reed kept both hands in the wound. Ellison came through the dust 30 seconds later with blood on her cheek and mud to her knees. "How many?" Hasker coughed. "None." She heard the word. Not the number. The word. None. No patients killed. No staff killed. Supplies destroyed. Roof broken. But 46 wounded men were still alive. The report filed that evening was a masterpiece of military language, trying not to admit what had happened. Lieutenant Ellison initiated an unauthorized alteration of patient disposition during indirect fire. The next line read, "Action prevented probable mass casualty loss." The administrative review opened on Monday. It closed on Thursday. No action. By then, the numbers had become harder to discipline than a nurse. Across the forward stations, using surgical nursing teams close to the line, survival in major penetrating trauma had more than doubled. Not everywhere, not magically. War still took who it wanted. But the pattern was too clear to bury. The nearer the skilled hands were, the fewer names disappeared into the dirt. On September 24th, Rourke's staff issued a new theater directive. All surgical nursing detachments within operational reach of an active front were to maintain 4-hour forward deployment readiness. Field commanders could request them directly. Medical review had to respond in 2 hours, not 2 days. No speech accompanied it. No apology. No one wrote Ruth Ellison's name at the top. That was how institutions changed when they were embarrassed. Quietly, in passive voice, and with just enough paperwork to pretend paperwork had thought of it first. Years later, when the war had become framed photographs and folded uniforms, a historian found a packet of letters in Colonel Vale's estate. Most were routine. One was not. It had been written in pencil on the back of a surgical supply sheet, dated 10 days after he was removed from the hotel. Vale never mailed it. Maybe because there was no one he trusted to read it. Maybe because the person he was writing to was the man he had been before the bone saw. The letter did not begin with an apology. That would have been easier. It began with a name. Private Daniel Reese, Ohio, 20. Then another. Corporal Eli Moskowitz, New York, 23. Then another. 6 names in the first paragraph, all men whose cases Vale had seen after Ellison's team came forward. He wrote that he had once understood casualties as movement on a chart, red figures, black figures, intake, outflow, bed pressure, personnel strain. Then he wrote one sentence in a hand that had pressed so hard the pencil tore the paper. I did not know the dead could be produced by neatness. Not cowardice, not hatred. Neatness. That was the word he chose. The terrible cleanliness of a system arranged so perfectly that suffering became untidy data. Vale resigned before the winter ended. He went home to Connecticut, sold the house his family had kept for 3 generations, and lived quietly in a town where nobody called him Colonel unless they did not know him well. He never contacted Ruth Ellison, not directly. But after his death, a local foundation's record showed annual gifts marked for rural emergency medicine, trauma supplies, and forward capability clinics in underserved counties. One of those clinics was in northern Minnesota. Ellison worked there for 32 years, bandaging logging injuries, delivering babies in blizzards, resetting broken hands in a room with a wood stove that never heated the corners. In 1953, her clinic received enough anonymous money to purchase a second sterilizer and a used ambulance with chains on the tires. In 1958, enough for a trauma supply cabinet. In 1961, enough to keep the night nurse position alive after county funding failed. There is no record proving Ellison knew where that money came from. There is no record proving Vale wanted her to know. There is only the category written on the ledger: forward medical capability. The phrase was clumsy, administrative, almost funny, but it was the closest thing Colonel Edwin Vale ever left to a confession. Ruth Ellison gave one recorded interview near the end of her life. The historian asked whether Vale was a bad man. Ellison waited so long, the tape picked up the wall clock. Then she said, "No, bad would be simpler." Another pause. He let the system teach him that order mattered more than nearness. Then the front taught him what nearness meant. The historian asked if Ellison forgave him. She said, "I was too busy for that." Then, softer, "But I was glad he learned names." That is the part the directive never captured. The new policy captured the hours. The casualty reports captured the survival rate. The logistics memoranda captured the trucks, the staffing windows, the authority chain, the response time. But none of them captured what the whole argument had really been about. Not courage against cowardice. Not nurses against officers. Not one general humiliating one colonel over breakfast. It was distance against disguise. The distance between the wounded and the skilled. The distance between a tablecloth and a stretcher. The distance between saying, "Losses are tragic," and hearing a 20-year-old ask whether he will keep his leg. Institutions survive by arranging distance. People survive when somebody closes it. Ruth Ellison did not invent battlefield medicine. She did not write the doctrine that followed. She did not put her name on the order that changed deployment rules across the sector. She simply refused to let trained hands remain decorative while men died outside their reach. And once those hands arrived, the arithmetic became impossible to ignore. 1 hotel, 3 trucks, 22 minutes at a checkpoint, 46 men under walking fire, a barn roof split open where the cots had been, and a colonel, years later, trying to explain on torn supply paper how many deaths could hide inside the word essential. The polished hospital had looked complete. The barn had looked broken. But the barn was where the healing happened, because the hands were finally close enough to matter. That was the lesson the war wrote in mud, blood, and rain. A hospital is not the building that stays clean. It is the distance someone is willing to cross before a man stops breathing.